The Deseret Book Audio Library presents Elder Gene R. Cook and a live presentation entitled 13 Lines of Defense, Living the Law of Chastity. This presentation was recorded in front of a live audience. And now, Elder Cook and 13 Lines of Defense, Living the Law of Chastity.
Now, I think part of being a chaste and a holy and a virtuous person, I believe, is having faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, to believe what He's told us about being that way. In essence, to be like He is, like Christ is, pure, holy, virtuous. And I bear testimony to all of you as we begin that it's worth it to be clean. It's worth it to turn away from the world and worldly things and to do the things that the Masters ask us to do. The blessings that will come, the peace of conscience, the peace that will settle upon you in being a virtuous person, in my judgment, is payment enough. But there are many, many other great promises that we'll review for a little while that the Lord has made to those who are pure and holy before Him. Now, as we talk this afternoon, I would remind each of you, brothers and sisters, to be sure and have a prayer in your heart while we're here together, because it's very important that you be in the real meeting. And the meeting isn't just the one between you and me, but more importantly, that the one between you and me and the Lord. And the only way to get into that meeting is to prayerfully be asking the Lord for instruction, praying, if you will, for me, that I might be inspired in what I say, praying that you might be humbled in your heart to be able to hear the promptings come to you, particularly as we treat this important topic. I'd hope that you would pray about that, and that as you have some promptings and feelings come, you may want to make a note of those and ponder them afterwards. Because the Lord will, I am sure, if you'll exercise your faith that way, will give you some impressions about some things that perhaps you may need to correct a little bit that are maybe not quite 100% right. Maybe some things you may need to add and start doing to even be a little bit more purified than perhaps you may now be. And again, I'm confident those will come if each of us will do our part to be truly in the right meeting, the one involving the Lord as well as the one involving each of us. I often think in teaching of something that happened some years ago when we just had 3 children. They were 3 boys. One was probably about 6 or so, and maybe 5 and 3, something like that. And I had them all lined up along with my good wife. She was on the couch, and these 3 boys were on the fireplace. They were listening to Dad, who had just given what he thought was the best discussion maybe ever given on sending little boys on missions. I'd really put my heart into it and told them of the importance of going on missions and that each young man ought to go, and told them why and bore my testimony. And when I was all through, I turned to this oldest one again, who was maybe 6, and said to him, "Well, Troy, are you going on a mission?" And there was a pause for a minute and a little bit of emotion, and he said, "No." And I choked a little bit, and I looked back over to his mom and then back to him, and I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Because, Dad, I'm still in my pajamas." And I think he was confident we were sending him right then, and he later told us he didn't want to go because he wanted to be with his mom. Well, I would hope as we talk that I'll do a better job of communicating than I did with him. And again, it's this thing of perhaps being on the right wavelength together, and then we'll truly understand. Let me direct your attention, first of all, to the Scriptures. And we're going to talk for a few minutes about what the Lord has said about chastity. We're going to talk a little bit about His view of that, the best I understand it from the Scriptures. We're going to then talk for a few minutes about Satan's plan and what he does to try to thwart the Lord's plan. And then a good part of this discussion this afternoon, we're going to center on some specific things that young people especially, and I'm so thankful to see a number of you here, and older people as well, can do to be sure that you keep pure and chaste throughout your whole life. And I'm confident that if you will do those things you already know and abide by some of these specifics we're going to talk through and give some stories and examples, that you'll be a pure and chaste person all of your life. So let's turn first of all and look to a few of these passages. First of all, I'm in section 131 to read 4 verses that says the following, very significantly to me. In the celestial glory there are 3 heavens or degrees. And in order to obtain the highest, a man must enter into this order the priesthood, meaning the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. And if he does not, he cannot obtain it. He may enter into the other, but that is the end of his kingdom. He cannot have an increase. Now what the Lord's telling us, brothers and sisters, is for us at least, and good members of this church, it isn't enough to just seek for the celestial kingdom. We're seeking for the highest part in the celestial kingdom to be exalted. And unless you arrive there in exaltation, married for time and all eternity, you will not have the great blessing that accompanies that promise the Lord has given to us of being exalted and thereby being able to have eternal increase. Family. You would not attain to what God has attained to. And thus the great importance of that. Sometimes young people say, Elder Cook, why do the older people talk to us so much about chastity? It seems like there are a lot of talks about that to younger people. And I guess I would say to you as clearly as I can, because there's an awful lot at stake, like everything is at stake. Have you ever thought about it before, that the main reason, the principal thing, for example, that distinguishes those who will be exalted in the top part of the celestial kingdom from all of the others, is that they will have the blessing of being able to use the sexual powers that God has given to man and woman. No one else will. And that's a very significant thing to me. And I think, again, I would be quick to remind you that everything that's found in the passages, in the Revelations, is calculated to take you to the top part of the celestial kingdom and nowhere else. They were written for that purpose. Sometimes I hear a young person say, Elder Cook, I'll be thankful if I even make the terrestrial kingdom. Well, he doesn't know what he's saying, does he? The passages, the church, the gospel are calculated to take you to exaltation in the celestial kingdom, the top part. Now let me remind these good sisters that are here, and these good brethren also. Sometimes when you talk about that particular topic, some are a little bit uneasy and say in their heart, but Elder Cook, I've never been married for time and all eternity. Or perhaps I've never had that opportunity. It's been interesting to me that a number of prophets have extended a promise to the good sisters, especially in the name of the Lord, that if they will prove faithful, if they've been single in this life and were unable to be married through no fault of their own, but that great man on the white horse just never came galloping by to get you, the promise has been extended to these faithful sisters that if they will be faithful, that they will, in time, be married for time and all eternity, either in this life or in the next, and that they will not lose one single promise, one single blessing that they would have otherwise received had they that blessing of being married in this life. Now, that can't be said too often to remind these good sisters especially of that great blessing extended to them. That would be true to some extent of the brethren, but the brethren are more in a position, aren't they, to ask and to pursue and to be the aggressors in that. And if a man goes through life and doesn't seek out a bride and ask her to marry him, he'll have to face the music, I guess I would say. Thus that promise wouldn't apply to him if he had opportunity to ask a young lady to be married and chose not to, or if in the light of day he chose to be married civilly and did not get married in the temple. Then again, those promises would not apply to him that the Lord has given to those who would be married in the house of the Lord. And I'm thankful, I'd be quick to add, that the Lord will make those decisions, won't he? No man will be able to judge that. The Lord himself will make those judgments, and you can be assured, all of us, that they will be righteous judgments. Now, one more time, what is the distinguishing difference between those who attain to the celestial glory, the highest part, exaltation? Answer, they will be able to live in a family life. They will be able to live as husband and wife. They will be able to procreate, to use those sexual powers that are God-given in this life, and will be able to be used in that life. Look at these interesting verses that come out of section 132 in the Doctrine and Covenants. I'm going to read verses 16 and 17 about those who attain the celestial glory but do not attain this top part that we've just talked about. These have always been sobering verses to me, very sobering. Speaking again of those who do not attain exaltation, but do reach the celestial kingdom. Therefore, when they are out of the world, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are appointed angels in heaven, which angels are ministering servants, to minister for those who are worthy of our more and an exceeding and eternal weight of glory. In other words, you'll be an angel in heaven if we do not partake of the new and everlasting covenant of marriage and be a servant, as it were, to those who did partake of that blessing of marriage. And then this one as well, it follows, quote, "For these angels did not abide my law. Therefore they cannot be enlarged, but remain separately and singly, without exaltation, in their saved condition, to all eternity, and from thence henceforth are not gods, but are angels of God forever and ever." Now, having been a married man for a number of years and having the blessing of 8 children, I cannot imagine a punishment that would be any more difficult than that one to me. To somehow, after having the blessing of being married and having a family, to be told that I will now be single through all of the eternities, worlds without end, and never ever be able to participate in the glorious covenant, in the new and everlasting covenant of being eternally married with a faithful sister in the gospel. I can't imagine the grief and the pain that one would feel, knowing he could have been, but perhaps chose not to be. Now, just a word about what I mentioned before was this distinctive difference. There's no question, brothers and sisters, that these sexual desires that have been put into man and into women are of God. They're the means for procreating. They're the means for sustaining the life upon the earth. They're the means for having children. There's a great blessing that comes to those that are married in using those powers. They are to be preserved in marriage. They are not to be used before. They are not to be used out of marriage. They are only ordained to be used into the marriage covenant. I've always liked this statement from the missionary lessons that says, and I'll quote it to you, "This creative power necessarily carries with it strong desires and urges. Strong because of the necessity to persuade men to accept the responsibility of a home and a family. And unlike the animal world where those urges come and go, or when they're in their season, as it were, that's not the case with men and women. Those urges are strong, and they're there, and they're constant, and they're through time, throughout our life. And again, meant to be controlled properly, meant to be harnessed and controlled under the direction of the Spirit of the Lord, so that they're used the way that the Lord decreed that they ought to be used right from the foundations of the world. I repeat one more time, if a man will do that and obey the commandments, keep the law of chastity and be a chaste person, the blessings that will come from having so done will be a great blessing to him and to his family. Let's talk for just a moment again then about the opposite of that for a moment as we think about Satan. And perhaps you've not thought of this quite in this way, and it might be of benefit to think through this doctrinally a little bit if you have not done it. If you were Satan and knew what he knew from the premortal life, and knew that the whole plan of salvation rested upon marriage, husband and wife being together, bearing children in this world, would you not do your best to thwart that if you could? Have you thought of that before? Satan, if this is as glorious a principle as it is, and as I have described it, almost an ultimate commandment as it relates to our being chaste and worthy and being able to be exalted one day, can you not imagine that Satan would unleash all kinds of things to try to foul that up if he could? Certainly would. I've kind of thought in a sense, and I don't suggest that Satan only has 3 plans relative to that, but I'm going to at least describe 3 that I think he does have, and see what you think of these. Would you not, as plan A, do your very best to keep spirits from coming from the premortal life? Wouldn't that be a good move? If you could somehow stop that, you would thwart the plan of God. How does he do that? When you think of that, of keeping children from coming from the premortal life, how does he do that? Abortion, birth control, sterilization. That's becoming a more common thing these days, isn't it? And perhaps even under that word birth control, if to have no children, then at least, if they don't go that far, then at least to limit the number that you have. In my mind, plan A would be to try to stop them from coming from the premortal life altogether, if I could. And largely I would focus in two areas. One, to convince them to have no children. Are there some husbands and wives around the world that have already bought on that? They surely have. Or if I couldn't accomplish that, then I would work upon men and governments the best I could to limit the number of children. Are there countries where that is the case? There are. Without naming specific countries, there's one that we all know of, I'm sure, that has a law about having only one child, and penalties assessed against parents who would have any more. Now that's purely a doctrine of Satan, and again, plan A would be to try to stop them from coming altogether if you could. Sterilization also, I'd put into that category. If you could get a male or a female to be sterilized so they could have no children, you have really thwarted not only the general plan of God in a sense, but the plan of God for that man or woman in large measure, haven't you? A very serious thing. Plan B, in my judgment, is if by chance a married couple, thinking the way that Satan would think, if by chance they conceive a child, now what shall I do? Plan B, I think, I'd try to get them to abort the child. I could still win if they've conceived the child. Now let's just get them to have an abortion if we can. And if he and his servants who assist him can plan in the mind of a good sister or a good brother that that is a good thing to do and continue to influence them evilly, unfortunately, brothers and sisters, there are many, many who have done that. I saw some statistics about 2 years ago. In the state of California, there were as many abortions in that 1 year in that state as there were people in the city of Oakland, California. Just imagine that. And that's not speaking disrespectfully of California, because that could be true of any of the states. In many countries, that or more. Tremendous number of people who would have otherwise come to the earth, who have not come, because Satan has sown so clearly the very evil doctrine of aborting little children when they are finally conceived. I would also try my best, if I could accomplish that, to have many of these children come to unwed mothers. Wouldn't you? If you really were following up the plan. In other words, if they're going to come, then let's get them at least with some broken families. And it'll give me a lot better chance, would say Satan, to get a hold on them. And he's pretty good at that and does his best to bring that about if he can. It's interesting as you think of abortion, the after effects of that on a good woman. Not only is he aborts the child, but in many ways is able to destroy the woman herself in her own self-esteem, in her emotional stability, and her spirituality, her closeness to God. I've talked to a number of women who have gone through that and have had a very difficult time afterwards gaining control and stability of self as a result of having gone through that experience. Then lastly, Plan C. And that's what we're going to talk about most all of in this discussion. That's where we're going to spend most of our time, and we'll involve you in the discussion with us as well. And Plan C is that if he could not keep them from thinking to have a child, and if he could not keep them from aborting the child, and the child is now going to arrive or has arrived on earth, then Plan C I've entitled really that it is that he will then go after an attempt to cause them to misuse their sexual powers. That's what he'll try to do. And thus, if he can, will destroy their abilities to become gods, to be able to reach the celestial kingdom, and have future children through exaltation, as we've talked about already. So if he's failed on those other counts, you can count on the fact he will be there for Plan C, to try to work on all of us to cause us to misuse these sacred powers that the Lord has given to us. And he's a master at it, and will do his very best to bring that about. Now just one other comment perhaps about Satan. Listen to these two verses from 2 Nephi chapter 2, verses 17, 18, and 27. And I, Lehi, according to the things which I have read, must needs suppose that an angel of God, according to that which is written, had fallen from heaven, meaning Satan. Wherefore he became a devil, having sought that which was evil before God. And because he had fallen from heaven, listen carefully to this, because he had fallen from heaven, and had become miserable forever, he sought also the misery of all mankind. For he seeketh that all men might be miserable like unto himself. My brothers and sisters, that's a sobering statement to me. Jesus seeks nothing but the happiness of his people. In great love, will do anything to try to save us or redeem us and help us. Satan's motive is to make you miserable like he is. And thus I would bear witness to each of you that if anyone has an idea that they could play around with Satan even just a little bit, they are fooling themselves. He is powerful. He knows an awful lot. He's had thousands of years of experience to tempt and try men and women much stronger than we are, and has won in many cases. And thus I would say to all of you, especially you young people, but you who are a little older as well, we must be disciplined enough to not allow any evil in our lives of any kind of that nature. Because allow a little bit in, and you'll have the rest in shortly. He is of that nature and a powerful being to bring that about. I'd like to have you help me for just a minute as we become a little more specific then of talking about how it is that Satan tries to get man to misuse these sexual powers, and what are some of these preventive types of things that we can do to protect ourselves so that we would never stumble or fall or break in any degree the law of chastity. And I think perhaps to do that, let me have you list with me very quickly in your mind, when you think of the law of chastity, and I would suggest that even by this title, as I have selected it, that it isn't a suggestion to be chaste. We're talking about the law of chastity. When you think of that and think about the world, the way the world reacts, what are some of the things the world does that are against chastity? Things either that will lead ultimately to one breaking the law of chastity, or that are very evil related to chastity in part, maybe some minor sins and also some major ones. Let's list a few to be sure we know that we're talking about the same set of sins. Some things again that would be against, if it will, being pure and holy and chaste. Yes?
The things we see on TV.
Okay, very good. TV can add an awful lot, can't it? Lots of evil things. There are good things too, but many evil things coming that way. Pornography. Good. Clothing and the way we dress, or maybe don't dress. Okay.
Speech, the way we talk to one another.
Good. Speech, the language we use.
Cultural acceptance.
Good. Cultural acceptance. That if we tolerate something, a saying, as you know, that, forgotten exactly who said that how does that go about sin? That first we abhor it, then we tolerate it, and then we finally embrace it. And it seems to go in that pattern, doesn't it? That if you start to tolerate it and say, well, it's not very good, but it's okay, in a sense we're already in phase 2, and before long, after a while, that which was really evil to you now is not so bad.
Couples who choose to live together without being married.
Thank you. Couples who live together without the benefit of marriage.
Music.
Music can affect us, can't it? Adversely.
Peer pressure.
Okay, peer pressure can surely impact us and cause us perhaps to do some things we would otherwise not do.
A focus through lots of different kind of mediums on self-gratification.
To really selfishly seek for what you want, take what you want, that attitude, instead of seeking to benefit and love and help other people.
No goals, to be bored.
Okay?
To have no direction in your
Sometimes
life.
just to be bored is enough to get someone really involved into sin, isn't it? There's that saying that says, idle hands are the devil's workshop. And I think there's a great truth in that, and why the Lord would command us to work all the days of our life, to be busily engaged. I think there's much more to that than I might have thought when I was younger.
Drug and alcohol abuse.
Thank you. Drug, alcohol, tobacco, all of those things ultimately can lead to one breaking the law of chastity. Maybe just in summary to name 3 or 4 other heavy words that are certainly totally against this word chastity are things like fornication, right? Adultery, homosexuality, lesbianism, masturbation. All of those kinds of things are heavy sins, difficult ones for people to overcome if they get involved in them, and again are directly opposed to the law of chastity in terms of one living a wholesome and a pure life. Now, just for one moment, if you were to imagine all of these on some sort of a scale of which sins are the worst, I'm sure that most of us would be quick to realize that all of these are sin that we've mentioned in some degree, aren't they? Those that certainly are the worst are probably these last group of fornication, adultery, abortion, homosexuality. Those would be way down on the bottom of the scale as those that are the most severe. Some have tried to suggest that something like homosexuality is not so severe, that it's something much more simple than someone who would have sexual relations with a woman or something if he were a man. Of course, that's not true at all. It's at least that severe and probably more. Very, very serious sin. Again, all of which, brothers and sisters, in one degree or another, are against, as it were, the law of chastity and the idea that we ought to keep ourselves pure and holy. Now, let me refer us to one more scripture, and then we're going to go into some of these specific protective measures that will help us preserve our purity throughout our lives. Let's look for just a moment in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, that says the following. And I might just add before I read that sometimes men are of a nature when they see a list of sins like that, and especially if they might have participated in some, even in part, to say something like, well, I'm not responsible for these urges or these things that come on me sometimes when I have an urge to break this commandment. And they act as if the devil made me do it. We've even heard that, haven't we? Some people say, well, the devil made me do it. Or I didn't have control. Or they try to somehow not take personal responsibility for their own sins. I've always been thrilled at this verse because it pretty much answers that question for me. Quote, "There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it." What a great witness from the Apostle Paul, that you'll never be tempted beyond what you can handle. And if you're a fairly weak person maybe, or a young person without too much testimony, Satan is controlled, my young friend, such that he cannot over-tempt you to a degree where you can't handle it. And thus you will always be responsible, all of us, for our own sins. He will tempt you up to that degree, I'm sure, as much as he possibly can, but the Lord has him contained so that he can't tempt you more than what you can stand. And thus who will be responsible for your sins? You will be, won't you? You can't ever blame it on the devil or on something else, because the Lord has that set in such a way that you can never be overpowered with more than you can stand if you'll abide those promptings that come. And then the great promise that when those temptations come and they're really bothering you and you're not sure exactly how to handle them, the Lord bearing testimony to us that with each temptation, when they come, the Lord will prepare a way for your escape if you'll take it. And that's the key. If you'll take it. I think as we discuss some of these stories, you'll see that manifest many times, where sometimes a young person heard the prompting and saved himself, and other times a person heard the prompting and ignored it and lost his virginity. So I'd remind us of that so that we don't get into a position of perhaps suggesting that someone else is responsible for our sins. Now let us be specific then and turn to some specific measures that I believe, if they're abided by, will keep you a pure and a chaste person throughout your whole life. And I would suggest to you, young people especially, and the older ones as well, to write these down and remember them. I'd write them in such a way that you can keep them for a period of time, because I've found a number of people who have done that and still have the list that you're going to make 2 or 3 years later. They're of that nature. So write in your Sunday handwriting, meaning the one you can read, such that it'll be saved, okay? I think if you'll believe me, you'll be glad you made these notes. Let's put the title here on the top of our paper then. The Law of Chastity is the title of that which we're going to talk specifically about. And then I'd like to put a second title underneath that. I'll need to explain to you, that says Lines of Defense. If you'll put that right under that title as well. Now let me explain what I mean by that. When I was in the university down in Arizona, I had learned to some degree, perhaps in high school, and carried it through to college, and hope you young people have learned that you want to pray over all of your subjects. pray yourself through geography and history, and pray yourself through math. You'll probably need help, a lot of it, and through science. And I remember listening to a history professor up in front teaching a big class. He was teaching about World War II and was describing some battles. And in the process of his description of all of this, I learned a great lesson about chastity. And I think it was because of that, of praying to understand not only what he was saying, but maybe something beyond what he was saying. And what he had done is he had described a battle camp, and with my right hand I'll just say this was Battle Camp A, and Battle Camp B that was here next to it. A was the Americans and the Allies fighting, and this Battle Group B were the Germans who were fighting against them, many soldiers being killed on this front. Now question, do generals usually go into those areas? No, they don't, do they? Where are the generals? No, they're back here a ways, aren't they? They stay back out of that. You could get killed if you went in there. So the poor soldiers, they're generally the ones there. And they're in what they call a command post. And in this command post is found typically those immediately around the general that are planning the battle. Lose the command post, and you may lose the battle and could even lose the war. And then what they create around that command post, between the command post and the enemy, are what they call lines of defense, or perimeters of defense, that are there to protect the command post from falling. Now, if one of those perimeters of defense collapses in some way, say it was an American line of defense that collapsed, they really only have two choices in that kind of a war anyway. One is to quickly erect another one for protection, or what would be the other choice? Run the other way. Now, I heard him explaining that, and the thought came to me, well, isn't that what really the law of chastity is? Isn't that the same thing? And here was what I thought to myself, and again, I don't believe I came up with this. I think the thought came to me. Elder Cook, in a sense, you're in your command post. And so the object of life, if I'm going to keep myself pure and holy, is to erect some of these lines of defense, these perimeters around me, some rules, if you will, that if I'll always obey these rules, I'll always be pure and holy and chaste. And that now is those things that we're going to analyze. And I would say this last comment, and then we'll start listing these and try to describe them for you. And I've listed, just so that you will know, I've listed 13 of these lines of defense that will protect you and your virginity. This last comment. The reason why I spoke so strongly about wanting to write these down is that I didn't make any of these up. I learned these from a handful of young people and a few older people as well who broke the law of chastity. Fortunately, in the church, my brothers and sisters, the great majority of all of our young people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them, are pure and holy and have kept this commandment. But there are a handful who did not believe, who did not obey, and broke the commandment. And as many of them have talked to me in a private interview and drenched my desk literally with their tears, they have said to me time and time again, Elder Cook, if you ever have a chance to talk to the young people of the church, please tell them this for me. Please tell them how dumb I was to have not realized by doing this little thing, it ended up causing me to break the law of chastity. And thus these 13 things come from some who know, and are also each one borne out, in my judgment, in the Scriptures. Number 1 says, write it down if you will, never be 100% alone. Never be 100% alone. Meaning being out totally alone with someone of the opposite sex. Meaning in my mind that you'd want to be careful of anyone who would like to get you out somewhere totally alone. And I'll address maybe in each of these comments first the younger people, and then a comment or two to some who are older and maybe married. It means, in a simple story or analogy maybe, something like this. And I'm going to use the names John and Mary in these illustrations, but it has nothing to do with anyone in this audience who might be named John or Mary, all right? But I'll use those names continually. It's like if a John said to you, girls, Marys, you know, I've been studying the stars lately and learned quite a bit. And I'd like to take you here just a little bit outside Salt Lake tomorrow night, 11:30ish or so, and show you a few things. What are you going to say? Yes or no? You'd say no, wouldn't you? Sure you would, because you know rule number 1. What about a young man that was bringing you home, Mary, from a date and said, Mary, it's only 10 o'clock. Your dad said you didn't have to be until 11:30. My family's on vacation. Why don't we just slip into my home and watch TV a little bit? What are you going to say?
I'd tell him to take me home right now.
Well said. You could say, well, we have a TV at our home too, John. And my brother's there. That may not be a bad response. Remember that, brothers and sisters, I've never known anyone who broke the law of chastity. I can't think of a single instance where they did not break rule number 1. And that's why it's there. Now, it means to be careful. We're talking to you young people for the moment. Before your missions, for example, the church recommends we don't date until at least age 16. The church recommends strongly that you go out in 4s and 6s and 8s, not just 2. We recommend strongly that you not go steady with the same person prior to your mission, for example. Right? And why? Because of that. I repeat again, I've not met anybody that broke the law of chastity that did not break rule number 1. So be careful. Be aware of anyone who wants to get you alone somewhere, totally alone. In the dark, out in the car, down on some lonely mountain road. Those, in my mind, red flags ought to go up just like that. And you'll see a red flag go up in your mind, and you could say, that's one of those things that our cook talked about. No thanks. And you'll be able to back away. And again, protect your own virginity, if you will. Now, just a word or two about those here who are a little older, just to be sure that we not think these things apply just to the young people. I'll never forget one time, President Kimball used to like to tell this story that went something like this. When he was a brand new member of the 12, it was a rainy morning. He was driving in from his home, not far from his home, and he saw a very pretty, young, attractive secretary who was standing out on the corner waiting for the bus. And in his graciousness, he thought, well, I ought to give this young lady a ride. And he stopped, he said, opened the car door and asked her if she'd like to have a ride. And she said, well, sure, I would, and jumped in. And he took her onto the office building. In those days, the parking lot for the Brethren was right outside 47 East South Temple, just to the north, and you could see the cars pull in from the General Authority's offices. And President J. Reuben Clark in the first presidency happened, and I'd put that in big quotes, happened to be just looking out the window when President Kimball drives up with this pretty young girl. Well, the young girl's out of the car and on her way, and of course nothing happened. You wouldn't need to worry about that, but it still was not right. President Kimball said, I got back to my office and I had a phone call from President Clark, and I was excited and raced down to his office thinking one of two things. He said, I'll bet they're going to give me some new assignment here at headquarters, or maybe a new assignment overseas or something. He was debating in his mind, as I remember, what President Clark might want to talk to him about. And when he got in his office, President Clark was kind and careful the way he approached it, but he said something like, as I recall, he said, well, Spencer, he said, why, you have a young wife. And he kind of said, well, he talked about Camille and told her a little bit, and they kind of went around. Well, or perhaps it was your daughter. It must have been your daughter. And then he kind of pressed on that a little bit, and finally President Kimball said, I realized what he was saying. And President Clark said to him something like, you know, Elder Kimball, it wouldn't be a good idea to do that. I know why you did it. Your motives were pure and right. I know that you wanted to be of help to this young lady, but it isn't right to be alone with someone else. It isn't right for the appearance of things either, is it? For what others might think or could say. Someone could fabricate something if they want and cause Elder Kimball a lot of problems. Even though they would have been lying, some might have believed. And thus we have to avoid the appearance of evil as well as evil itself. And I would suggest to you married folks that you wouldn't want to be alone with someone else that's married either, would you? To maybe take home the Relief Society president, brethren, after church sometime. Or maybe to just innocently take your secretary to dinner. Now, if you want to do something like that, make sure your wife's with you and the three of you take her to dinner. Or if you're going to go to lunch as a department or something in your work, make sure that it's done as a group, but not just the two of you. Be very careful, because I repeat, that's where it all begins. Number 2 says, learn to say no. Learn to say no, and then this added phrase, plan it out in advance. Plan it out in advance. Learn to say no, plan it out in advance. It would be like if a fellow came up to you and said to you sometime, you younger boys, and pulled out of his pocket a cigarette and said, are you not going to smoke? Not even one time? Come on, you could try it once. Once is not going to hurt you a bit. Will you?
No.
No, you won't. No. I think it helps to think through, as a young person especially, what would you say when you're really tempted? Will you be able to handle it? As was said earlier, a lot of peer pressure. Or would you cave in maybe because 3 or 4 other men around you say yes? Seems to me if you've thought that out very clearly and maybe even practiced a response or two, no thanks. I don't smoke. I'm surprised you do. That wouldn't be too bad. When I was younger, and it may not work so well today, we used to say no thanks. We don't smoke cancer sticks. We're not planning on going to the other life so soon. Whatever you might say, but the answer being no. What would you do, Mary, if John were trying to touch you in an inappropriate way? You know what I mean by that, you young ladies? You wouldn't want to say, John, no. Better say, John, no. And smack him a real good one, would you not? And if he's a good John, he will be ever grateful that in a weak moment you were strong and he maybe was not. If he were not so good of a John and ever tried that again, good sisters, I would drop him just like that. Because no man has a right to touch or handle someone in an inappropriate way. And that again is only reserved for that Satan, isn't it? So be careful of someone who would try to suggest that that's part of love or that it's okay to do that. That's a lie and not right and against the law of chastity. I might just say lastly on that, as you plan things out in advance, we recognize for some who come back from their missions and are now dating more heavily, seeking for a spouse, we know there'll be times when you'll be out dating alone, just the 2 of you, but be very careful. Be very careful, because Satan will do his utmost to try to bring you down, if you will, on the level where he is. I found it a good practice, and I hope this won't sound too odd to some of you, but it served me well as a returned missionary. I was determined to find me a wife, and to find one rather quickly. And the Lord blessed me to be able to do that rather quickly. And I determined that one of the principal characteristics would be that she'd want to be a spiritual woman, someone who really had a powerful testimony, somebody who was clean and worthy, a faithful Latter-day Saint, someone that really had the spark. She had to have the spark for me, or I didn't want to marry her. That's a good part of marriage too, isn't it? It's not all just spiritual things. The other's a good piece of it too. But I determined the best way to find that out is that I would ask him to pray with me on the date. So whomever I took out on a date, the first time when we got out in the car, I would say, you mind if we have a word of prayer before we go? And most of the young ladies that I dated, they were all LDS, but most of them thought, well, some were a little bit surprised, but said, well, no, that'd be all right. And then I'd either pray or maybe get her to pray. There were a few who were quite shocked and a little embarrassed. I didn't marry any of those. And it perhaps told me a little bit about them. And I often thought, as those years passed by, that because of that prayer of our both, a worthy young man and a worthy young woman, praying that the Lord would protect them, would have an enjoyable time together, that they would do what is right, that there was never anything untoward or out of order that occurred, because I think the Lord was with us on the date. And thus in your planning things out in advance, maybe you would want to consider that and not feel embarrassed about it. At least I wouldn't, because after all, if a good woman is not up to praying with me, she's sure not going to be my wife. And I would imagine you'd think the same. Okay, next, number 3. A simple one, but a very important one that says, if necessary, run. If necessary, run. Some might say, well, this is too easy, Elder Cook, I already know that. I know a young lady about a year ago that I had an interview with that unfortunately did not believe that. She believed it but didn't do it. She told me that she was making out with her boyfriend, and they were doing more than they ought to be. And the prompting that came from the Lord to stop right now and leave. But in her heart, she said, I'll just stay a little longer and convince him that we ought not be doing this. And unfortunately, brothers and sisters, she lost her virginity that evening because she did not follow the prompting. She should have just run and left, but maybe for embarrassment or whatever reason did not. I often think, as I think of this, one of our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Joseph in Egypt, right? That I suppose most all of us are related to. He's a great example of this. It says in the scriptures in Genesis that he was tempted by Potiphar's wife. She tried 2 or 3 or 4 times, and maybe more than that for all we know, to get him to break the law of chastity with her. He answered her, no, no, no. He told her that, how could I offend your husband? How could I offend God, my God? I will not. A man of great integrity is Joseph. And then the scriptures say that he came into the house one time and found her there alone. I'm sure Joseph knew rule number 1, but he didn't know that she was alone. And he got into the house, and when they got into the house, the scriptures say that she took him by the clothing. You can imagine that they were standing awfully close. Can't you? I mean, breathing about on one another, I'm sure. And the next verse simply says, Joseph fled. He ran. Joseph ran. I've often thought, did Joseph stay and ask the golden questions? No, he didn't. Did he stop to maybe give her the lesson on the law of chastity? Wrong timing, isn't it? Wrong timing. What did he do? He ran. Now, my young friends, and you older friends as well, may I say to you that if you're in a situation anywhere that's starting to heat up, that you know is not right, and you begin to have those feelings, and they'll come to you from the Lord, or the other feelings that may be really stirring you in a way you ought not be stirred sexually, the best counsel we could give you is run right now. Don't stop. Don't wonder about it. Don't think about it. Don't worry about embarrassing somebody or even embarrassing yourself. What should you do? Run. Get out of there right now. And I bear testimony if you'll remember that. And watch for that, because you'll be faced with that somewhere. You remember that counsel, and you leave right now. Now that's true for you married folks as well. You find yourself sometimes in a difficult situation, a temptation on the part of someone else, or even feeling tempted yourself. Don't even stop to think about it. Remove yourself from that place now, and you'll be safe. Number 4 is a quote. It says, a little bit will not hurt. A little bit will not hurt. This is one of Satan's favorite sayings, I believe. He loves to use this. After you've written that down on your paper, will you take your pencil now and cross out the word not, so that it's a true statement that a little bit will hurt. Let me give you an example or two of that, if I might. In fact, I'm going to put up 2 others, and then I'll tell you 2 or 3 stories because they relate to all 3 of these, and it might be more meaningful if you had all of these in your mind before you hear the story or the example. Number 5 says, obey the word of wisdom 100%. Obey the word of wisdom 100%. And number 6, select good friends. Select good friends. Again, just 2 or 3 stories that might illustrate that to be sure we're understanding one another. I remember a young priest one time that I interviewed who had been going out with some friends that were not so good. He had been with the priest, but he had begun going out now with some other young men that were not that good. And these young men were smoking, and they had been working on this young man, John, to smoke. And he had told them no 100 times, but he finally caved in and said, well, I think a little bit won't hurt. Just 1. And he started smoking a bit. And he got into the priest quorum one Sunday morning. And while they were seated there together, 7 or 8 priests, one of the priests did this. "Ha ha, you've been smoking, John." And he pointed out to John in front of everyone. John was terribly embarrassed, turned red in front of them all, and was extremely embarrassed. As he left the meeting that day, he thought he made a little decision. It ended up being a very, very big decision. He said in his mind, "What shall I do? Do I continue to be friends with these priests, or shall I go off with my other friends?" And unfortunately, brothers and sisters, he decided to go with his other friends. I met him 6 months after that, quote, little decision, end of quote, at which time I found him having broken the law relative to drinking alcohol, the word of wisdom. He had been involved in a few drugs, and he had broken the law of chastity 2 times when he came in and confessed what he had done. And he said to me through his tears, "Elder Cook, for one dumb cigarette, that's what did it to me. If I'd have just not done that." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I didn't realize that my friends were doing a lot more than smoking. I thought it was just smoking. But then pretty soon I found they were drinking. Then I found they were doing other things worse than that. And before I know it, I was ensnared in it with them." And then said again, "For one dumb cigarette." Very, very telling, brothers and sisters. Some say about videos, well, it just has 1 or 2 bad scenes. And I always think a little bit will hurt. You can get some of those things in your minds, can't you? A scene or something like that that's very difficult to get out of your mind. It's garbage. And if it gets into this clean mind, if you will, it's very difficult to get it out. The key being to not get it in the first place. I remember another example of a young man who had resisted his young boyfriends to not drink. They were on an athletic team, and he had done quite well at it, but they continued after him and after him and after him. And he finally thought, erroneously, unfortunately, if I do it one time, go out to the bar with him and drink, I'll get him off my back. At least they'll leave me alone and quit teasing me about being a Mormon. And so believed the lie that if he just went out once and drank with them, they'd leave him alone. Well, if you want to get a drink, my young friends, where do you go to get a drink? You go to the church? No. The bishop's house? No. Where? To a bar, don't you? And is there more than just drinks at the bar? Yes, there is. There are women who have a lot more on their mind than just having a drink. Well, this 18-year-old John didn't know that, and went in to have a drink with the boys, and an hour or so later came out, again an unchaste person. And once again in an office, confessing to one of the brethren, after having appropriately confessed to his bishop and stake president, he wept over the fact that he had been ensnared by one dumb drink. And he told me, he said, "Elder Cook, if you ever have a chance to tell the young people, we can't stand up and confess our sins to people who have broken the law. But," he said, "some of you brethren who have talked to us, we hope you'll tell them how dumb we were, that they would not fall into the same mistake." And I'm quoting him and saying that about how dumb he was. That's what he told me. And one other example on this about good friends. I think with respect to friends, it's almost like that old saying that we used to say when we were young: we don't drink, we don't smoke, we don't chew, and we don't go with girls that do. Have you ever heard that? We don't smoke, we don't drink, and we don't chew, and we don't go with girls who do. It was kind of setting a standard in the old days as to what you wanted to have be your girlfriend, somebody who was of a standard like you were. Well, as I think of this selection of good friends, I can't help but think that many a good thing and many of an evil thing began therein. Take a good look at your friends as young people. Your male friends and female friends. If they're good, wholesome young people, my, you're fortunate. And I'd keep them around you, and I'd be loyal and true to them. If there's something less than that, I would seek for some other friends. Some say, "But Elder Cook, we're trying to redeem this non-member, and we know he has all these bad vices and that." Well, remember, we have a program for that called missionary work. Send the missionaries to him. Not have a young lady try to save him. We've lost many a young woman who has gone in the name of the missionaries, as it were, with the idea that she would date this young man and finally save him. And we know we have non-members in the church who have become members thanks to their spouses, and that does happen on occasion. We know many, 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 many more examples where it has not happened and gone the other way. So my counsel to you with the non-members, brothers, if you have someone you really care about and want to see them join the church, send the missionaries. Or work with them in 3s or 4s, but not you, a young lady, for example, with a young man non-member. Not worth it. And one last reflection. As I think back into my youth, I was surely blessed to have some young friends that were good. There were 2 young men and 1 young woman that were very close to me, 4 of us. I can't think of one single instance through our youth, one time that I can recall, where any one of them ever suggested that we go do something evil or wrong. They were just good young people. And as I see them now as adults, as old as I am, with their own wives and children and husbands and children, and see they're faithful and strong, I'm not surprised. I knew them when they were young. And that's how they were. And thus let us be careful again who your friends are, because you'll marry people just like whom you're choosing as your friends. And that could be good news for most of us, and it might be bad news for some as well. Let's look at the next one then, number 7, that says, avoid pornography 100%. Avoid pornography 100%. Pornography, my brothers and sisters, in my judgment, is a disease. It's an addiction. And someone that gets started in it and looking at dirty movies, dirty books, or involved in dirty jokes, or anything like that that is filthy and not becoming of a Latter-day Saint, can become very quickly addicted to it. Very, very difficult to stop doing it if you once get started. I'm not sure why, but this seems to be an affliction much more of the young men than it is of the young women, although it can affect both. And we would surely counsel you young men especially to be very careful of that. The best counsel anyone could give to you on that is just don't ever do it. Just don't get started. Because I repeat once more, if you do and start looking at dirty pictures or dirty books or anything like unto it, what it does is incites in you a desire to see more, have more, do more. And if you persist in it, in seeing those things and playing them out in your mind, I can promise you you'll end up acting them out in time. All of these things, ultimately, if persisted in, will lead you to breaking the law of chastity. And thus a very difficult one. Are there pornographic materials in places even like these where we live? Like where would you find some? Or where do we see pornographic kinds of things? Let's just be sure that we're communicating clearly with one another. Like where?
Grocery store.
Grocery stores. In magazines, for example. Where else? Movies. Very difficult. I'm not surprised that President Benson would tell all of us as members of the church that we're not to go, of course, never to an X movie, nor to an R movie. And yet there are many who are still going to R movies. I guess they have not really believed yet the President of the church. That's risky business in my mind. Where else? Novels. Sometimes they can write some things in novels that can incite those powers extremely, much more almost than maybe even seeing some things. And thus one has to be very careful.
Telephone soliciting.
Telephone. Sometimes there are these numbers in that can be called and can hear filthy things over the phone, can't they? Some others that come to mind? Yes.
Music, either radio or dancing places.
Okay, as well. Music can surely do it as well, can't it? Again, without mentioning it, and it can be conveyed in dirty jokes or dirty stories or anything like that. I guess the clear counsel of the brethren and the scriptures as well, brothers and sisters, is you just don't be involved in that. We want to be clean and pure and holy. We want to have those kinds of thoughts in our minds, not some of the rest. And thus the best counsel, again, with pornography is leave it alone. I've had some adults who have said to me, in talking to them for just a moment, well, I'm an adult. We can see an R movie. Now, of course, we don't let our children see them, but we can. What do you think of that? Someone? Please.
The scriptures tell us to become like little children.
Well said. Well said.
He's my son, and we don't go anywhere that we wouldn't take our children along.
Well said, Mom. Well said. If it's not good enough for your son, it's not good enough for you, is it? And to have a double standard somehow, and unfortunately some have not understood that. I'll tell you about the children. They'll have the same standard or worse. There's got to be one standard. It's the Lord's standard, and we all abide it, whether we're old or young. Well said. Thank you for that.
This is the end of CD number 1. Please continue listening on CD number 2. 13 Lines of Defense, Living the Law of Chastity, by Elder Gene R. Cook. CD number 2.
Let's look at number 8 for a moment. It says, avoid impure or intimate language 100%. Avoid impure or intimate language 100%. I think of another John who told me one time as a young man who confessed and had broken the law of chastity, when I asked him, well, where did it begin, John? How did all of this start? And his answer was, he said, Elder Cook, it began in my case with some dirty stories. Some boys told me these dirty stories, and they were sensual and sexual in nature. Rather exciting, he said, for a young boy. I heard them. I thought them through my mind over and over, and I began sharing them with some of my other male friends. And he said, then the bad mistake is I began sharing them with some girls. In the beginning it made them laugh and they were embarrassed, but I began going with some girls who they didn't laugh and they weren't embarrassed. And that was my mistake. And then again, for a young man who broke the law of chastity, said to me, it began with dirty stories. I've heard some adults say that there are adult jokes. Now there may be some that are funny jokes about married couples and things that maybe children wouldn't understand, assuming they're clean and wholesome and right. But if by that some adults mean that there are some adult jokes, we'd have to apply the same standard that was mentioned a minute ago about movies and pornography, wouldn't we? That if it's not good enough for our children's ears because it's impure, then it's surely not good enough for our ears being adults. Number 9. Avoid little natural man tendencies. And I will add again, 100%. Avoid little natural man tendencies, 100%. I've listed 3 or 4 of these that you might want to make a note of. That sometimes, again, these improper urges that end up leading to one breaking the commandments are not recognized early enough and thus end up leading someone down the trail of ways before they awaken and realize that Satan himself is planting some thoughts into our mind and causing us to be led by him down the trail. Listen to this passage of Scripture that perhaps I ought to read first, and then I'll describe what I mean by natural man tendencies. I'm in 2 Nephi chapter 28. I'm going to read most of verses 20 through 23. It's a prophecy relative to the last days dealing with Satan, and it says this, for behold, at that day, today, Satan shall rage in the hearts of the children of men, and stir them up to anger against that which is good. And behold, others he flattereth away, and telleth them there is no hell. And he saith unto them, I am no devil, for there is none. And listen carefully to this phrase. And thus he whispereth in their ears, until he grasp them with his awful chains, from whence there is no deliverance. Yea, they are grasped with death and hell. And what do we learn from that? How does Satan speak to us? What did that say? He whispers in our ears. Remember that the real you is a spirit inside of that body, isn't it? It's not the body that we see, it's the spirit in you. And thus if he's going to communicate, one of the ways he does it is through feelings and thoughts. And he's able to whisper into someone's mind and say, Psst, John, look at that. That looks to me like a real good movie. Look at that video case. Whoa. Hey. And then plants a thought or two that it's okay. No one would ever know. And maybe starts whispering in their ears. Have you had times when you just had a feeling come over you sometimes, maybe really an evil feeling, it just seemed to come from nowhere? Have you felt that before? I see most all of you shaking your head. I have too. It just seems like it just pops out of nowhere, like it wasn't me. Well, I personally believe that's old Scratch himself, Satan, who puts a feeling or a thought into your mind to try to get you to respond to that evil voice. Now, if you turn it away right away and turn away and say, no thanks, I'm not interested, then he will not have power over you. But if you say, well, let's think about that a minute, and offer that thought a chair to maybe stay for a while in your mind, and we'll kind of mull that over a little bit, you're on the trail, aren't you? So be careful, because these things that we've talked about, I think, begin in our thoughts. And Satan is capable of planting a thought in our mind so that he can try to influence us to be led by him. Listen to a few of these natural man tendencies then that I'll just try to briefly describe, and I think you'll recognize all of them rather quickly. And perhaps I'll do it from the point of view of a man trying to affect a woman, if I might say it that way. And thus it'll be maybe more meaningful. Are there ways through innuendos for a man to communicate things to a woman? And if so, kind of like how? What do I mean by that?
The way he looks at you?
Okay. He could look in such a way that instead of seeing a sister in the gospel or a good friend, he could see something else, couldn't he? And a good woman would normally be able to recognize that, probably, wouldn't she? She could probably sense that rather quickly. But an awful lot could be communicated by your eyes, just the way you look, couldn't it? What else might be?
Slang words with double meanings.
Thank you. Slang words with double meanings that cause someone to not know for sure which do you mean, and would allow you to deny it if somebody were offended, wouldn't it? Pretty tricky way of perhaps making a point, or maybe taking the temperature of a woman to see where she is. Again, these are worldly things that are going on every day in the world, and something we would not want to participate in, because they are natural men tendencies, I think, that will lead further down this trail we don't want to be on. Some other ideas come to mind of how you might convey something to someone through innuendos?
Through something that they responded to you maybe innocently or honestly, and then you twist it or turn it around or misinterpret it on purpose back to them.
Good. And maybe twist or turn and respond some way that maybe she didn't mean it, but you twist it and turn it for your own purpose. Good. They can also be done sometimes through notes, can't they? I've seen some do it that way, to write some note that, again, maybe is full of innuendos, or maybe just a lovey-dovey type note to somebody that is not your wife. And you could even do it in a joking, kidding way, but it could be read and misunderstood by her, and you could be playing around with fire with these innuendos.
Inappropriate body movements and a person getting too close.
Very well said. One that many times can convey some things that if someone were interested would mean something, and if someone were not, would surely be quick to reject that. And I might pursue that one just a little further with two or three thoughts like these. Sometimes in the way someone even shakes hands with someone, it could be, instead of a polite handshake between a man and a woman, it could be a lingering one, couldn't it, for a period of time, and start to really convey some things physically by touching that are not right. President Kimball used to say that a good man and a good woman would want to lovingly greet each other that way with a handshake and nothing more. He used to teach the idea that a priesthood leader or even a good man would not want to put his arm around someone else's wife and tell her what a wonderful woman she is. Much better to shake hands with her and maybe tell her that if it's even appropriate. But as you say, the body contact, being too close, if you were to do that and get really close to someone and stay there a little bit, all of a sudden there's some things that can start to happen, isn't there? And thus you want to be very careful of that. Some of the young people have got into some bad habits in going to see videos in what they call back rubs. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. That is totally inappropriate. Some boy maybe says, or a girl, boy, I've got such a hurt back. I was out shoveling all day today, and I'm so sore up here in my right shoulder. I think you could kind of just work on it a little bit. Well, again, you just crossed the line, and it's a danger signal. There ought to be one of those red flags go up right now, because I would say to you again clearly that you really don't have a right to touch any other person, say of the opposite sex, I think, except basically shaking their hands and lovingly the way you might your own sister or something, but nothing more than that. And to be very careful, because as you said, body contact or any close contact can convey some things that ought not be conveyed. And maybe just two other comments on that one to warn us to be careful of. And it has to do with what we said a minute ago about with the eyes, of not having any real second glances or looks. Sometimes someone will see something inappropriate, and instead of turning away, will try to get a second look. And again would tell you that the natural man is taking command. I've often loved this statement that a servant of the Lord, in an immodest moment, that he may see, with, say, a good sister will cast his eyes down or away, meaning that he would not try to take advantage of some weak moment. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I think a modest man in an immodest moment of someone else would turn his eyes away. And I think the spiritual man would be in that man who would do such a thing. And just one more reminder for some of you who are a little older, remember that sometimes you're placed into circumstances in church callings where males and females are together very closely, in like a young men presidency and a young women presidency where you meet together a lot. Or a secretary and a boss situation where you're with that female much more time than your own wife, for example. In my judgment, in those situations, you've got to even be much more circumspect, much more than even you would normally, because of the time together that could very, very easily lead into some difficult things. I've interviewed a number of married men over the year who had began with their secretary and beginning to talk too intimately with her, sharing too much, telling her of your personal problems or listening to hers, and getting into some of those intimate talks, and it will always lead somewhere else. And thus I would suggest again that we be totally circumspect in those relationships, and you'll be safe. Watch for the warning signals, brothers and sisters. Don't they come? Let me take just a moment and have you think about that for just a moment. Don't the warning signals really come when something is wrong? Do you know that it is, or does it just get you and you never even knew? What do you think? Would a couple of you respond to that?
Doesn't sneak up on you. You know it's coming.
You really know, don't you? Down deep you know. You might try to deny it, but you seem to know. Does anything come to mind in your thinking about that? Of, do we really know? Does the Lord alert us to those things? And does our conscience, which was given to us to alert us to those things, really? Somebody react to that? Yes.
Well, usually it requires breaking other laws. You know, sometimes you in order to cover this, you have to lie about this, or you're someplace where you shouldn't be at this time, or you don't do what you should have done here. You begin to let go of all of the things, just little by little, that you ought to be doing.
Okay, well said. Thank you. Yes.
I think we have to be willing to be transparent so that people can see the whole of our life and we don't have anything to hide. Because if there's something we're covering, there's something that needs to go.
Thank you. We ought to be the same man at home as the fellow at work or at church. There can't be a double-minded man, as the scriptures say. Well said. Thank you kindly. You can sense that in some people too, can't you? That have two different agendas they're running. The good man on Sunday, perhaps, maybe, and then there's the other man, the natural man that runs some of the rest of his life. We really have to become one. If we'll do that, brothers and sisters, my testimony to you is on that the Lord will alert you. Your conscience will alert you. There may be a time or two when you get into a situation innocently, you walked into something, but you'll still be alerted it's wrong. And the key is move out now. And if you'll do that, you'll be safe. If you try to play around with it in the least, it's very likely you'll be burned. And we'll talk as we come to the conclusion of this discussion about thoughts, because it really begins there. And someone could even receive a compliment from someone of the opposite sex that was either innocently given or maybe intentionally given more than should have been, and start playing that through their mind and start imagining, what about this, or what if I were married to him, or what about this? And if you let your mind go down that track again, we're on very dangerous ground. And many have ended up ultimately breaking the law of chastity, having started just with something like that, a compliment that was maybe calculated in such a way to really affect you, and maybe would have had you not taken good control in the beginning.
Satan knows when you're vulnerable to that sort of thing too.
Doesn't he? Thank you. Well said. He seems to know our weakness, doesn't he? And he watches for moments when he could at best get you. And thus be very, very alert, brothers and sisters, because as we said before, he's been around, and he's tried and tested enough people. He knows all the tricks. And you'd be easy catch, as would I, if you were to play around with him and allow him to have free sway with us. I would just say in conclusion to number 9, I've always loved the direct way the Lord handles this about men and women and these other associations we have with people of the opposite sex. This statement is very simple and very clear. Thou shalt love thy wife with all thy heart, and shalt cleave unto her, and none else. Now that's pretty strong language. Thou shalt love thy wife with all thy heart. Not part of it, all of it. And shalt cleave unto her, and none else. Now, no one could explain that away. That's very direct. And again, I think the Lord's clear to us on what it is He wants us to do with respect to our relationships with others other than our wife. Here's number 10, a very important one that someone mentioned a few minutes ago, that says, select wholesome music. Select wholesome music. Sometimes young people have a feeling that the music they listen to doesn't have anything to do with this. And yet, as I've had the opportunity to interview many of them in varying countries around the world, I've found that's just not so. I believe without any doubt there's music of the Lord. There's good music men have created, romantic music, maybe some good cowboy music, some just fun songs that are okay and they cheer you up and they're fun to be involved with. And there's also music of the devil. And it ought to not surprise us that he has his music too. And it's found throughout the world and has great impact upon young people, especially. Let me try to bring that one alive by telling you a true story that happened with an individual whom you probably have heard of. I'm sure most of you would have. How many of you have heard of the name Mick Jagger? I just see your hands. I think almost everyone. He's one of the most famous rock stars in the world, isn't he? Well, you might be surprised to know that I had about 2.5 hours with him and proselyted him on an airplane and had quite an experience. And I'm going to relate part of that here to you to maybe illustrate this important point about selecting wholesome music. We were on a flight that originated in Mexico and we're headed to, I believe it was to Houston or to Dallas, as I recall, somewhere in the northern part of Texas. And as I sat down, I was first in the seat and sat there, and later this man came and sat down by me. And I noticed right up front that he was reading a rock magazine with wild-eyed faces and some half-dressed ladies in the magazine. And I offered a silent prayer, as you would have done, as I've tried to talk to people about the church that are sitting next to me, that the Lord had inspired me what to say as I talked to this man. And so after I'd offered that prayer, I said to him something like, "My name's Gene Cook. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What's your name?" And he said, "My name is Mick Jagger." And I said, not realizing who he was, "Well, I'm glad to meet you, Mick." And then he said, "I said, my name is Mick Jagger." I said, "I heard you, Mick." And then he said, "This is me." And he opened up the magazine and pointed to his picture, and then I knew finally who he was. I just hadn't thought about sitting next to him, but it was so. What I'm going to say, brothers and sisters, in no way is speaking evil of Mr. Jagger. And please understand that. I'm not speaking evil of the man, but I am of what he represented, because it was wrong. It was of the devil himself, in my opinion. As we talked for a few minutes, I noticed, first of all, that his pant leg was pulled up a little bit on his calf. And I looked at it and thought to myself, I guess this happened even before I knew who he was. I thought, this fellow looks a little sick. That his flesh looked a little sick for some reason. I'm not sure why, but saw that, and it caught my attention before I asked him who he was. After we countered back and forth a minute or two about what we're doing here and all, I finally said to him something like this. I said, "You know, Mick, I have a question for you that I'd like you to answer me." And he said, "Well, I'll be glad to try." And I said to him, "You know, I have opportunity to be with the young people in many different places around the world. And some of them have told me that your kind of music that you sing and others like you has no effect on them, that it's okay, that it doesn't affect them adversely in any way. And others of the young people have told me that it has a real effect on them for evil, and that it affects them in a very bad way, very honestly. You've been in this business for a long time, Mick. I'd like to know your opinion. What do you think is the impact of your music on the young people?" This is a direct quote, brothers and sisters. He said something to this effect. He said, "Our music is calculated to drive the kids to sex." Those are his exact words. I'm sure to have such a bold response, I must have had a real look of shock on my face. I really did. I'm sure that I did. And then he quickly added, he said, "Oh, it's not my fault what they do. That's up to them. I'm just making a lot of money." Then told me that he'd been in Mexico making the video because he could make it for about a third the cost there versus in the United States. Told me this was a great day for them because now instead of just having audio where they could portray whatever they wanted to about sex and all the rest, they now had videos and could show it and have the person hear it and see it portrayed. That this would give much more impact and was selling much more, and that he again was making much more money. We talked, brothers and sisters, as I said, for a couple of hours. As we went through that discussion, there were 4 or 5 salient things that happened that let me just share with you, because it teaches again, in my judgment, the importance of this thing about music. As we chatted, I told him that I was married and had 8 children, as I recall, or maybe it was less children at that time. He told me that he was not married, but had 3 children, and was proud of it. Told me that he had had 1 girl that was pregnant in Virginia, 1 in New York, and 1 in England, as I recall. Told me that it didn't matter what you did in life. You could take whatever you wanted. You could do whatever you wanted. There were no commandments. There was no God. It didn't matter. There was no judgment day. You just do what you want. Whatever I told him was black, he said was white. And whatever he said was white, I told him it was black. It was just about that bad. We talked as we went through the experience of many things. He told me that he had had the missionary lessons. And in the beginning, I didn't believe that. But as I talked to him further, I think that he probably did. I think he told me he had 2 or 3 lessons. And I think that's probably true. Because of some of his responses to me, it made me at least think that he probably had been exposed to some of our missionaries. They were missionaries in England, by the way, according to him. He said, as I listened to your Mormonism, your problem is that you have all things you think figured out. And he said, life isn't that simple. And then he would go on and explain some complex thing, some theory of men, and I would answer him in a very simple way from the Scriptures, and he would say, see what I mean? But trying to make things much more complex than they really were. It was interesting as we talked further, he told me he believed in evolution, that he had descended from a monkey. I told him with a smile, that might be the only thing you're right about. But we pursued that, and the fact that if you're going to subscribe to the philosophy he had, then you'd have to believe there was no God, and the only answer to that is you must have evolved. And if there's no God, there's no commandments, there's no rules, and thus you can do whatever you want. He told me the importance of freeing the youth, that they ought to be able to do whatever they want in spite of their parents, that the parents were inhibiting much and controlling things they ought not be. Amazing to me. Told me he was thankful that the family was being destroyed, the entity of the family around the world. And I gathered from what he was saying that he was doing his best to help that along. I've only been mad, I think, at 2 investigators in my life where I kind of got upset, and he was one of them, because as we proceeded in the discussion, he had maybe had 4 or 5 alcoholic drinks now. And as you know, they tend to be, when someone does that, tends to be a little looser in the way they talk and things. And in a rather loud voice towards the end of this discussion, he said something like, and he said, furthermore about your Book of Mormon. Your Book of Mormon is a lie, and any man that believes it is a liar. And he said it in such a way that most people nearby could hear that. And that really did upset me. I thought to myself, here's a man who is representing the evil that he is, trying to announce it now to the whole cabin, to try to make them feel that these things about the Book of Mormon are not true. And I felt impressed to say to him something like, well, Mick, you're mighty fortunate today. Mighty fortunate. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, because you're sitting next to a servant of the Lord who plans on correcting what you just said. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you're really lucky. I just happen to have a Book of Mormon right here in my briefcase. And I reached down into my briefcase and pulled out this Book of Mormon and put it on his lap. And it was shaking, brothers and sisters, back and forth, just about like that, really shaking in his hands. And I then told him something to this effect. Mick, this book has changed my life. I love the Book of Mormon. I have read it many, many times. It is the greatest book in my mind on the face of the earth. In my view, it has changed me. It's made me a better man. You say it's a lie. I must have missed that part. Show me. And again, I put the book in his lap. Show me. And my young friends, there was just total dead silence. He didn't say a word. And I finally said, well, maybe you were offended by the part where Lehi told his sons to be honest men, where he taught them to rely upon the Lord and to have faith in God. Maybe you were offended when Alma told his boy Coriantumr that he had broken the law of chastity and told him what he had to do to correct it. Maybe that offended you. Or maybe it was the part when Christ came that really bothered you when he said that you're to love thy wife with all thy heart and to not commit adultery. Maybe that offended you. And carried on a little bit with him that way. And of course, again, he could say nothing. I finally said, well, if you can't show me a chapter then at least show me a page. Or maybe a paragraph will do. That'll be all right. Just show me one paragraph. And again, brothers and sisters, dead silence. And finally I said, well then how about a line or one word will do? And then I finally bore my testimony to him and said to him, my friend, the lie is not in the Book of Mormon. The lie is in you. And I bear witness to you in the name of the Lord that if you don't turn your life around, you'll be going to hell. That the devil himself will come and get a hold on you. And I bore my testimony to him as strongly as I could, brothers and sisters, about what he was doing. That it was not right. It was not according to the Lord's plan. And I felt very emotionally involved when I bore my testimony because I thought to myself, here I'm going about the earth trying to strengthen the young people like the rest of the brethren are and the good sisters, trying to make them better and strengthen them, turning them to the Lord. And men like this are coming around right behind us trying to tear it all down, to destroy the family and destroy their reliance upon God. And bore a very fervent testimony to him and told him that I'd be a witness, that I had at least given him the word. Well, he calmed down quite a bit in that encounter and quieted down and didn't say any more. That at least quieted him down so he didn't go in the vein he was in. We talked the last 5 or 10 minutes then in a more general way and finally bid each other farewell and split up. I might add that he did make one comment, as I recall now, after I had challenged him to show me something, after he could not, and I took the Book of Mormon back. He finally said, oh yes, now I remember. And I said, what? He said, it's the part about Brigham Young. And I informed him that Brigham Young was not even mentioned in the Book of Mormon one time. That ought to be part of that story because that's exactly what happened. Brothers and sisters, as I arrived home from that trip with my family, I was very moved, as you would have been, about the spirit of what I felt, more importantly than the words I've conveyed to you. That spirit that bore witness to me of the evil nature of that kind of music and the impact it had on people. I talked with my family about it that very next night. We had a family home evening. We made a commitment as a family. We would never ever allow any of that kind of music in our home ever. We had a great spiritual experience together where we felt that spirit and committed to that. And now as those years have gone by since I visited with him on the plane, I'm pleased to say that that's never been in our home, and I think never will be as a result of an experience I'm thankful that I had. And share it with you, especially my young friends, to impress upon your mind that there is music of the Lord and there is music of the devil. And I'd be mighty, mighty careful in my listening to the music that you listen to. The church is never going to publish a list of approved songs and say, here's 146 you can listen to and 246 you can't. You'll have to choose, won't you? So use your conscience, use the Spirit of the Lord, and have enough sense to make those judgments right and not listen to that kind of music. Just one other comment that perhaps in conclusion about that. When I arrived home, just a few days after that, my wife and I were up late on a Friday evening one night and turned the television on, or maybe we looked in the paper, I guess, and saw that there was going to be a Mick Jagger special on that night. Well, I'd never even watched anything like that before and thought, well, let's see what it's like. And so we sat up for an hour, as I remember, and watched the whole thing from beginning to end. I was really taken back. Mostly not so much by what I saw, I expected that, but it was evil, it was full of it. But mostly impressed with all of the innuendos in there that a young person would not be very aware of that are sown in the lyrics of do what you want. No one can tell you what to do. You're your own man. Take what you want. Pick what you want. It was the same stuff I'd heard on the airplane for 2 hours. It had no rules to it, no God in it, no what's right in it. It was you do what you want to do. You're free. You can take what you want, do what you want. And I was very much impressed of how that had been sown very subtly in all that music, that many young people would not realize, after have it being sown in them time and time and time again, would begin to parrot that kind of a philosophy maybe to their parents, of not being as obedient to their family as they ought to be. I bear testimony to you again that good music can have a great impact on you. Evil music can surely be of the devil. Think for just a minute now to contrast that, if I might, for a quick moment, before we leave this number 10 about music. Think of the great contrast of something like, I am a child of God, and He has sent me here, has given me an earthly home, with parents kind and dear. Lead me, guide me, walk beside me, help me find the way. Teach me all that I must do to live with Him someday. Again, what a dramatic difference, brothers and sisters, as that hymn would lead you to think of the Lord, wouldn't it? It would humble you in your heart. It would lead you to be obedient to your parents. Look at the different impact that would have. Or if you had a song like, Oh, my Father, thou that dwellest. What if you had that in your repertoire, as it were, what you sang or what you thought or what you listened to? What a difference. Little songs from the primary. Jesus said, love everyone, treat them kindly too. But when your heart is filled with love, others will love you. Very simple, isn't it? One of my favorite ones is an easy one, a simple one. Oh, Father, look on us today and bless us with thy love. In Jesus' name we humbly pray. Oh, Father up above. So simple. I've sung that to myself many times as I've wandered around alone in airports or other places to keep my mind focused on what it ought to be on. Music has a powerful impact for it, good brothers and sisters. It'll help you raise your family faithfully. Be sure to use it. Maybe one last one. Think of the impact on your children if they sang over and over again, I love to see the temple, I'm going there someday. Wouldn't that have a great impact? It would, and one day they would end up there, I believe. And I repeat, if the music is other than that, this other kind, they may end up somewhere else. Be sure that's in proper order. Number 11. Be 100% modest. This was mentioned earlier by someone, and it's surely a key point, and let me describe that a bit if I might. I guess the guideline we have that the Lord's given to us is that Adam and Eve were told when they realized they were naked that they were to dress themselves and to properly cover up their body, weren't they? It was a temple of God, both a male's body and a female's body, not to be shown to just anyone, but again to be reserved in the sanctity of marriage for your mate, only for your mate. And again, that sacred process that can occur in a marriage. I think it's a significant thing that the devil would again work on that. He knows those rules and will do his best to try to get us to inappropriately show off our body, if we will. I think an endowed woman or an endowed man who's been to the temple may be a good example, my young friends, your parents or someone else who's been endowed, to dress like they dress, and you'll be safe. To me it means, and maybe I direct this to the young women for a moment, it means, sisters, that you'd never have a real low neckline of any kind, right? No, you wouldn't. It means you wouldn't have a high skirt line that came up and showed off more than it should to the knee and above. It means you wouldn't ever want to have a slit, for example, in your skirt to show off a little bit more of your thigh. Would the Lord ever inspire a good sister to do that? No, He wouldn't. Then who does inspire it? Well, that ought to be fairly clear to us. And thus don't participate in those worldly kinds of things. It would mean, sisters, that you wouldn't wear transparent blouses or clothing that was too tightly fitting or anything that would inappropriately show off this great temple that has been given to you, your body. I think that's a very important thing. I'll never forget again one time a young woman I talked to many years ago who ended up breaking the law of chastity, who told me something to this effect that I'll just tell you very briefly. She said, Elder Cook, I reached age 19. I'd never had a date. And she was a reasonably attractive girl, but for some reason, no one had ever asked her. She was broken-hearted. She was sad about it. Felt she'd do anything to go on a date. Unfortunately, one of her friends, and it really wasn't a friend, a non-member girl, said, your problem, Mary, is you don't know how to dress. Let me teach you. And unfortunately, our good Mary listened to this non-member friend, and she told her and taught her and showed her how to expose a little bit more here and a little bit more there to attract the boys. And did it have that effect? Yes, it did. But unfortunately, she didn't attract boys who could be good husbands. She attracted some other boys who were interested in a lot more than just seeing an immodestly dressed girl. And unfortunately, in her own words, it all began when I began to dress immodestly, and then later broke the law of chastity. It seems to me that Satan can't get us on some big item. He starts on these little ones and tries to work on them to get you to be a little bit more worldly than we would hopefully ever be. I think sometimes when I think of worldly things that we'd want to be very careful and be moderate in the jewelry that's worn, to not overdo it, in the makeup that's worn, in the way we dress and with our hair, and men with their hair length, and anything of that nature. The Lord's mannerism is to be temperate, to be moderate, brothers and sisters. He doesn't want us to be fanatical about it, but be careful and not become worldly or think you ought to have the best and latest fashion that's just come out. To me, that's always been a warning signal that I may be stepping over the line and trying to be more worldly than I ought to be. So be very careful with that. Maybe just a couple of last comments. I had the opportunity some years ago to interview some young women who, in their employment, were determined to be dressing immodestly. That was not a very good assignment to be given. It was a difficult one. Let me say it again. There were some young women who were dressing in a particular place in their employment and not dressing as modestly as the employer thought they should be dressed. They had been talked to privately about that by their supervisor, but had pretty much rejected the counsel unless they were sent to me to talk to me about it. Well, that was not an easy assignment, I'll tell you, talking to a sister about that. And I learned one lesson out of that. I learned a number of lessons, but one important one was that I didn't talk to one of those young women who thought she was immodest. In their own heart, they thought they were being modest. I really believe that, but they really weren't. And it raised a question in my mind then, and as I thought more about that there really is a difference between what men perceive and women perceive, brothers and sisters. Women are not nearly as affected by some of that as men are, and they think that men think and feel like they do, and they don't. I guess the best counsel is to just be sure that we appropriately cover our body such that it not be in any way exhibiting more than ought to be. There ought to never be anything about you that comes over more strongly than the real you. That's the true principle. And I'll say that again. There ought to never be anything about you that comes over more strongly than the real you. Meaning your hair is so wild, as it were, that's what I first see. Or the jewelry is so out of order, that's what I first see. Or the way you've maybe not covered yourself appropriately is what I first see. That's not the principle. That's not in accord with the principle I just mentioned. These two passages say it perhaps best. If there is anything virtuous, lovely, or of good report, we seek after these things. And ye must practice virtue and holiness before me continually. Even so, amen, saith the Lord. Again, I think those passages say it very clearly. Number 12. Number 12 says, avoid petting 100%. Avoid petting 100%. By that, you young people, you know what that means, meaning to touch or to stimulate another person, including yourself, in an inappropriate way or in a sexual way. That really is out of order, and in my mind it'd be kind of almost like, it'd be about as dumb as if I had a stack of dynamite up here with all the fuses straight up, and I was sitting on top of the stack and asked one of you to toss me a torch. And I sit up on this stack of dynamite catching that torch. Now that's not very good sense, is it? You're going to be heading surely for the other world. Petting is just like that, my young friends. It's dynamite. And anybody that get involved in that, it will surely lead to everything. And thus is really not appropriate. It does not have a place again except in marriage. And any young man that would try to convey, for example, to a young woman that was part of showing her love for him speaks a lie. If he really loved that young woman, he would want her to be pure and holy and chaste, and to marry her that way, and to take her to the house of the Lord, not try to get her to degrade herself somehow, or him, by participating in something like that in petting. I remember one time many years ago, a young man whom I knew, who after one of these discussions caught me alone. He said, "Elder Cook, it sounds to me like I shouldn't even be kissing my girlfriend. You're pretty strict." And I knew him, and I knew he was French kissing his girlfriend, overdoing it. And I said to him something like, "Well, that's not a bad idea, to not kiss your girlfriend." He was then taken back more, and he said, "Kissing doesn't affect me at all, Elder Cook." Do you believe that? I didn't either. And I said, "Do you have any blood?" And he said, "Yes." "Then it affects you." He said, "No, it really doesn't. It doesn't affect me any." And I said, "Well, then why don't you try this?" And I learned this from S. Dilworth Young one time. I said, "When you take your girlfriend Mary home tonight, why don't you just shake hands with her at the door and then kiss the post in front of her house?" And then he finally said, "Well, I guess there is a difference." Well, sure there is. If I had a young lady and was kissing her or holding her up here close, it would affect me, would it not? And it would affect her. So you remember that and be very careful. And I think it not a bad guideline to think to self, I'll reserve those intimate affections for the one whom I really love, the one with whom I will kneel at the altar in the house of the Lord. And I'll do my best to save those for that particular person. I honestly believe that that's a very good guideline and will safely see you through some challenging times that surely will come to all of us and have come to many of us over the years. Remember then, the principle is that no one of us has a right to stimulate sexually any other person, including yourself, except it be your own spouse. I think that's a good principle. I remember a case one time of a young man that, when we were talking earlier about will the Lord prompt us and help us, I know a young man that was really tempted, severely tempted by a woman who was somewhat older, divorcee even, who had a fairly bad reputation. I'm not sure if this young man knew that or not, but he was tempted by that severely. And one night sneaked away from his house and thought, I'll just go pay her a visit. I mean, nothing, I wasn't planning on anything, but just go pay her a visit. He tells us he started to leave the house, that he had a strong impression from the Lord telling him to go back, to go home. He said, I know in my heart, I knew that. But I said, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to go visit a bit. He said, I continued on to her house. Before I got there, the impression came again. It was very strong to turn back now. But unfortunately, said he, I did not heed it. He said that within maybe 40 or 50 paces of her house, it was right during a light rainstorm, a lightning bolt came down and struck 100 feet from where he was walking. He said, I don't know if that was by chance or some other signal, but I took it to be a signal. And this young man at that late moment turned around and went home. I ended up knowing that woman, who ended up being the cause of another young man being excommunicated from the church. I am certain without any doubt, had that young man proceeded another 100 feet or so to that home, he would have lost his virginity that night. Now, we don't all have a lightning bolt that come down and maybe scare this young man, but those promptings are real and they will come. Let's be sure we truly heed them, brothers and sisters, and then, again, we will be safe. Just one last question that might cause some pondering for all of us, and again, especially these young people. Take your hands and hold them out in front of you a minute, would you? Face up so that you can see your palms. And look at them. Would you take a good look at them? And let this question pass through your mind. Where have these hands been? Where have these hands been? And if we could say, as a young man, for example, passing the sacrament, maybe blessing the sacrament, helping lift my sister when she fell down and hurt her knee, changing a diaper, says maybe one young woman even here, or kindly loving, helping someone who needed help, cooking a meal, reading the scriptures, that's where my hands have been, I think that person would really feel very much at peace in their heart. If they had to answer some other way of where have these hands been, that would maybe cause remorse and repentance, then perhaps we do need to turn away and clean up our lives and be sure that that peaceful feeling could be in your heart as you look at these hands. Remember that, you young people. Hopefully we can always say as we look at our hands that they have been where they ought to have been, and have not been someplace they ought not to have been. Let's list the last one, which is number 13. Control your thoughts. Control your thoughts. We've learned, brothers and sisters, as human beings, that thoughts turn to acts, do they not? And acts turn to habits. And habits will turn to your ultimate destiny, what will become of you. That process works for good or for evil, doesn't it? That good thoughts will lead to good acts, to good habits that will end up developing your ultimate character and your destiny. It works the other way too. Bad thoughts to bad acts, to bad habits, to a bad character that will lead you someplace you do not want to go. I think it all begins in our mind. And I think if you've made some notes on this discussion, you might make number 13 as if it were a foundation in your notes. Because I believe that this is, I put it last on purpose, as one in essence that holds up all of the rest. Because for good or for evil, I believe that it all begins in your mind. And if you can control your mind in what you think, you'll not have much problem with the rest. Now 3 suggestions about how to help control your thoughts. An A and a B and a C maybe under your 13. A is to pray. When you have some of these temptations or feelings come upon you, brothers and sisters, pray with all your heart that the Lord will remove them from you. I'm convinced if you'll humbly pray, the Lord will give you a new heart. He'll give you some feelings that will come and chase away those evil feelings that have either come to you via the world or maybe planted by Satan himself. None of us are protected from evil thoughts. They come to all of us. It's a matter of whether you're able to chase them away or not. President Lee was asked one time as president of the church if the devil ever bothered him. His answer was, "He is at my heels continually." I was impressed that he was with him, trying to get President Lee even, but more so where he was, at his heel. Easily to be stamped on, I might say. Not a bad idea. Read the scriptures, or quote the scriptures. When you're being tempted, memorize a passage or 2 of your favorite ones and say them out loud if you can, and you'll chase away the evil spirit. Memorize again, I repeat, 2 or 3 of your best quotes, and if you can say them out loud, the better yet. They will chase away those evil feelings. Remember in the 3 temptations Christ suffered, brothers and sisters, his answer 3 times in a row was via a scripture, wasn't it? He was able to handle Satan through the scriptures. Satan even quoted him a scripture, didn't he? But the Lord was not diverted from that and continued in each temptation to quote him a scripture. I believe the scriptures hurt his ears, Satan's. I love to quote them and to say them out loud. C, the 3rd one, is to sing hymns. When a bad thought comes or an evil feeling, brothers and sisters, again have a hymn or 2 memorized that are your favorite to bring the Spirit of the Lord to you. And if you will sing it away, out loud if you can, it will chase away that evil spirit. If you can't do it out loud because you're in a public situation, then as we were taught one time by Elder Packer, give a nod to the conductor in your mind and start off the orchestra. And start it playing the best you can. And if the thought persists, have him turn up the volume a little bit so that your orchestra will drown out the evil thought. It has great impact. I think of, again, a hymn as any hymn would do, but I think of one like how great the wisdom and the love that fill the courts on high, and sent the Savior from above to suffer, bleed, and die. be very difficult, brothers and sisters, to pursue some evil intention or evil thought if with your heart you sang a hymn like that or some other. The Spirit of the Lord will come. Now, I apologize for my lack of ability to sing, but I did it on purpose to show you that if I can do it, you can do it. Okay? You can sing in the shower, sing on the way to work. Get used to singing. It'll bring the Spirit of the Lord to you. Now I need to conclude, and I'd like to conclude with these last 2 or 3 thoughts. First of all, it's important in my mind that you might know someone who's already broken the law of chastity in part or all. And if you do, the best counsel I could give to you to give to that person is that they ought to humbly confess to the Lord what they have done and immediately go to their bishop or branch president and confess to him. Sometimes people think that if they just pray away something like this in their bedroom, that's good enough. That is not so. The Lord has set up the procedure that we must go face to face and talk in confidence with the bishop. No one would ever know it but you and him and the Lord. But if that were to occur, that's the way to become clean. These good bishops of the church are talented. They know what to do and can help you put into place a plan so that you can become clean once again. And if we abide the counsel they give us and do what's right, you then will be able to be made clean. I've always loved this scripture, brothers and sisters, in Doctrine and Covenants, section 58, verses 42 and 43. Behold, he who has repented of his sins, the same is forgiven, and I, the Lord, remember them no more. By this you may know if a man repenteth of his sins, behold, he will confess them, and he will forsake them. Thus again the counsel that if you've had a problem, any one of us, or you know someone that has, lead them to the bishop. And then that great promise, thanks to the Lord Jesus Christ, will be true, that though your sins be as red as scarlet, they can be made as white as the driven snow. Thanks to the Lord Jesus Christ. What a great blessing that if some of us have stumbled, or stumbled a bit along the way, that there's a way to yet become clean, that the Lord can clean us up and have us ready for that day when we yet will enter into the celestial kingdom. I think of these great passages that have always meant a lot to me since I was a young man, and maybe will to some of you who are young. If my heart is pure, I then have the strength of 10. I believe that's true. If my heart is pure, I then may have the strength of 10. And another one, be ye clean, that bear the vessels of the Lord. Be ye clean, that bear the vessels of the Lord. Brothers and sisters, may I bear witness to the fact that if we will persist in our desire to be clean, pure, and holy before the Lord, if you'll persist in that, sin will gradually begin to lose its attractiveness. It was built to be attractive to man. And what a great promise that if we will continue faithful, it will begin losing its attractiveness to us, and thus you will really become as God is, with no desire whatsoever to do anything wrong. I love this passage from Mosiah chapter 5, verse 2. And they all cried with one voice, saying, after King Benjamin had addressed them, Yea, we believe all the words which thou hast spoken unto us, and also we know of their surety and truth, because of the Spirit of the Lord omnipotent, which has wrought a mighty change in us, or in our hearts, that we have no more disposition to do evil, but to do good continually. What a great witness that if we'll persist, we'll be able to finally have that gift given to us to not be attracted by sin. And perhaps these last 2 passages from Mosiah chapter 2, verse 41. Moreover, I would desire that you should consider on the blessed and happy state of those that keep the commandments of God. For behold, they are blessed in all things, both temporal and spiritual. And if they hold out faithful to the end, they are received into heaven, that thereby they may dwell with God in a state of never-ending happiness. Oh, remember that these things are true, for the Lord God hath spoken it. I bear testimony, brothers and sisters, to keep the law of chastity is worth it. To keep the commandments is worth it. You'll be blessed both temporally and spiritually for having so done. And then this last promise, a great one from section 121, verse 45 and 46. Let thy bowels also be full of charity towards all men, and to the household of faith. And let virtue garnish thy thoughts unceasingly. And then this great promise. Then shall thy confidence wax strong in the presence of God. And then the doctrine of the priesthood shall distill upon thy soul as the dews from heaven. And then the Holy Ghost shall be thy constant companion, and thy scepter an unchanging scepter of righteousness and truth, and thy dominion shall be an everlasting dominion, and without compulsory means it shall flow unto thee forever and ever. In my judgment, forever and ever, as an exalted, eternal being, one who is pure and holy and chaste before the Lord. Now may I bear my testimony, sisters, in conclusion, for you young people. I know no greater joy than to kneel at the altar in the house of the Lord with someone worthy like you. To kneel across from the altar from that man or woman and know that you have kept yourself for them. And then inviting the Lord into your marriage by being married into the temple. It becomes a marriage not just of two, but of three. The Lord, with the Holy Spirit of promise, seals it up in time such that it can be a marriage that will last forever. And you who are older, and again including all of us in this one, there will also be a day when I believe we will kneel at the altar of God in the end. And our works and our very being will speak for itself whether or not we have kept the world out of us, whether or not we have truly been pure and holy. I pray with all my heart that the Lord will bless each of us here today, that as we leave that we'll have a greater commitment to do what is right, to truly keep ourselves pure and holy before the Lord. I bear witness to you in the name of the Lord that if you will do that, you'll have added revelation come to you, added peace. You'll have direction come from the heavens to a man or a woman who's trying to keep self holy and pure. May the Lord bless us to teach one another appropriately these principles, to teach our children, our grandchildren these principles, that they may not be ensnared by Satan and dragged down to hell as is his design, that we might be miserable like him. I bear witness again, last of all, that if we will keep the commandments and go forward and do these things, that there is no reason that we may not one day, there is no reason for the which we will not one day end up in the celestial kingdom exalted, because we will be as God is. May the Lord bless us to do that, brothers and sisters, to be in control of ourselves, to know the Lord's protection is with us just through the veil, that he will provide a way for escape when temptations come. And if we will know that and believe that, we will be able to remain pure and holy. May the Lord bless us to that end. I bear witness that these things are true, that this is the only true church upon the face of the whole earth, because the Lord said so. That the prophet Joseph Smith is a prophet of God. The Book of Mormon is true. President Ezra Taft Benson is a prophet of the Lord today. I bear witness to these things and to these truths we've discussed in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
This concludes this presentation of 13 Lines of Defense, Living the Law of Chastity by Elder Gene R. Cook. This has been a production of the Deseret Book Audio Library.